I said goodbye to my husband that afternoon, knowing it could be the last time I saw him alive. His hands were cold, his skin paper thin, and the machines around him hummed like a ticking clock, counting down to something I wasn't ready to name. I kissed his forehead, told him to rest, and somehow managed to walk out of that hospital room without collapsing. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I walked out the glass doors of Vanderbilt Medical Center like a ghost in my own life. But what happened next? I never could have predicted. Because just a few steps later, sitting on a wooden bench in the courtyard, I overheard a nurse say something that would change everything. Not just for my husband, not just for me, but for a man we hadn't even met yet. And for the kind of miracle that doesn't show up on any medical chart. If you've ever believed that love alone isn't enough, or if you've ever fought for someone when the world told you to let go, stay with me. Because this is not just a story about sickness and loss. It's about what happens when the impossible whispers hope into your ear. Don't forget to subscribe to Avenged Stories, where true love, justice, and redemption find their voice. One story at a time. The sun was shining that day. Spring in Nashville was in full bloom. Dogwoods swaying, light catching on the windows of the hospital tower. But to me, it felt like standing in the middle of winter. A cold so deep it wrapped around my bones. People passed by, smiling, talking about dinner plans or ball games or baby showers, and for a moment, I wanted to be one of them again. Just another woman planning a weekend. But I wasn't. I was Joanna Calder, 35 years old, a registered nurse, and the wife of a man who was slowly dying in the ICU behind those walls. His name was Elias. And 6 months ago, we were still talking about where to go for vacation and what kind of dog we might get when we finally bought a house with a backyard. We thought we had time. We thought we had forever. We were wrong. Elias wasn't just my husband. He was the kind of man people trusted on sight. The kind of man who could turn a pile of lumber into a dining table and make it feel like a family heirloom. He had these calloused hands, strong, rough, but so gentle when he held me, that I used to tease him could build anything but a break from work. We met the night after my last exam in nursing school. I was exhausted, barely functioning, and my roommates insisted I needed a drink and something fried. So we ended up at this tiny cafe downtown, a converted brick warehouse that smelled like roasted coffee and old books. That's when I saw him, Elias, coming in with a brown paper bag full of hardware, dust clinging to his jeans like it belonged there. He looked around for a seat, our eyes met, and he nodded toward the empty chair across from me. I remember thinking he looked quiet, but not shy, just grounded, like the world could shake and he wouldn't flinch. We talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. About how he built furniture for a living, about my dream of working in pediatrics, about how we both hated olives but would commit crimes for good peach cobbler. When he laughed, really laughed, his eyes crinkled in the corners, and something in me just softened, like I'd found home in the middle of a Tuesday night. After that, he showed up everywhere, sometimes with wildflowers wrapped in butcher paper, sometimes with jars of local honey from a roadside stand. Once with a book I'd mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier. That's how Elias loved, not loud or flashy, but with attention, with care. He remembered the little things. 2 years later, we stood under an old oak tree behind my aunt's farmhouse, saying vows we wrote by hand. I wore my mother's pearl earrings. He cried when he saw me, real tears, no shame in it. That's who he was, open-hearted and unafraid to show it. We moved into a fixer-upper at the edge of town, just us, a 100-year-old wooden porch, and a list of repairs longer than our mortgage agreement. But Elias took it as a challenge. He sanded floors, patched walls, built a bookshelf with hidden compartments just for fun. And for our first anniversary, he surprised me with a rocking chair he built himself. Smooth, curved, every joint hand-cut. He didn't even ask if I liked it, just said, "You look like you needed a place to breathe." We'd sit out there most evenings, the two of us rocking in silence or laughter, watching fireflies rise from the grass like little glowing promises. Life felt whole. Not perfect, We still had dreams we couldn't quite touch yet. A bigger house, a family, maybe a dog. But I didn't need more. I had him. His steady hands, his steady heart. And if I'm being honest, that was everything. It started with something so small, I didn't even notice. Elias came home from the workshop earlier than usual, wiped sweat from his brow, and said he was just tired. Long day, nothing more. But then it happened again the next day. And again. Until I realized he wasn't just tired. He was pale, slower, quieter in ways that made me uneasy. Then came the bruises. At first, they looked like the normal nicks and bumps a carpenter would get, one on his forearm, another on his ribs, but they kept showing up, bigger, darker, in places no saw or chisel could explain. One night, I woke up to the sound of him gasping for air beside me. He clutched his chest, eyes wide with panic, and that was the moment the nurse in me shoved the wife aside. I took him to the hospital the next morning. I told myself it would be something simple. Anemia, stress, maybe some vitamin deficiency. We'd get a prescription and go back to building bookshelves and burning pancakes on Saturday mornings. Instead, we were sent to hematology. The doctor was young, but his eyes had the weight of someone who'd delivered too many bad diagnoses. He sat us down, closed the folder in his lap like he couldn't bear to read it out loud again, and said 5 words that cracked something open inside me. Aplastic anemia, and it's severe. Elias just nodded, steady as always, like he'd just been told the weather forecast. But I felt the ground shift beneath me. I'd studied this disease. I knew what it meant. His bone marrow, the source of every red cell, white cell, and platelet in his body, was shutting down. Quietly, mercilessly, like someone flipping off a switch to his life from the inside. The only treatment? A bone marrow transplant. But here's the thing. For a match that's safe and viable, they look first to family, siblings, parents, blood. And Elias didn't have any of that. He had no birth certificate with names, no phone number scribbled on a napkin, no uncle in the next county. He grew up in foster care, passed around, a boy without roots, and now that missing family tree wasn't just a wound. It was a death sentence. We joined the National Registry. The doctors said we might get lucky, but they also said it might take months, maybe years. And Elias, he didn't have that kind of time. He never complained, never let his voice shake. He just smiled and told me to stop pacing, and reminded me that we'd made it through hard things before. He joked about losing his hair and whether he should finally get a tattoo if the chemo made him bald. But at night, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him whispering prayers into the dark. Not for himself. For me. I tried to match his strength. I did. I held his hand through every transfusion. I straightened his blankets and kissed his forehead and told him, "We're going to beat this." But every time I said it, the lie tasted more bitter. I knew what we were up against, and I knew we were losing. Some days I hated myself for being a nurse, because knowledge, in times like these, isn't power. It's torture. I remember the day his doctor pulled me aside in the hallway, away from Elias. He spoke so gently, like the words would hurt less that way. "We're running out of time." I nodded, my jaw locked so tight I thought I might crack a molar. I thanked him. Then I walked to the hospital courtyard, sat on a splintering bench beneath a blooming dogwood tree, and let the weight of it crush me. It was supposed to be spring, but all I could feel was winter. I used to think I understood loneliness. I'd seen it in patients who had no one at their bedside, in old women holding a nurse's hand like it was the only one they'd felt in weeks. But I never knew what it meant, truly meant, until I started watching Elias disappear. Not all at once, not in some dramatic drop of vital signs. It was slower than that, crueler. The color drained from his face. The light behind his eyes dimmed a little more each day. His voice, once deep and sure, grew thin like paper left out in the rain. And still, he smiled. He smiled when I walked in. He asked about my day. He cracked jokes about hospital food and told me to stop fussing like a mother hen. He tried so hard to make me feel like everything was fine, even as his own body betrayed him. But I knew better. I saw how his hands trembled when he reached for his water. I saw the bruises, purple and black, blooming like poison under his skin. I saw the weight he lost, how his ribs pressed against the hospital gown, how he winced when the nurse inserted another IV. He didn't want me to see any of it. He wanted to be my safe place, just like he always had been. And I wanted to be his miracle. But I wasn't. I was a nurse. I could chart his vitals, I could explain the disease, I could prep the chemo, measure the platelets, and adjust the oxygen flow. But I couldn't fix him. I couldn't give him what he needed most: a matching donor, a sibling, a family. And that was the kind of helplessness that haunted me. Every night, I'd go home to our empty house and walk past the rocking chair he built me on our first anniversary. I'd run my fingers over the carved initials on the armrest, J and E, and wonder if someday I'd sit there alone. I cried in the shower, behind closed doors, into towels that smelled like cedar and detergent and grief. I screamed into pillows. I whispered prayers to a God I wasn't even sure was listening. Not for a cure. I stopped asking for that. I just begged for time. One more week, one more meal, one more firefly evening with his hand in mine. I tried to imagine life without him. I tried to see the porch without his chair, the kitchen without his laugh, our bed without his warmth, and I couldn't do it. Every time I tried, my chest seized like it was being crushed by something invisible and cruel. Like grief had already started folding itself into my bones. Somewhere in me, I started to let go. Not because I wanted to, but because I thought I had to. Because I'd seen enough dying to know when the body was giving up, even if the heart wasn't ready. And that, I think, is the most brutal kind of mourning. The one that starts before the death. The kind you carry quietly, the kind you don't speak of. The kind where hope turns into guilt and love becomes a countdown. That was the day I sat on the bench outside the hospital, hands clenched in my lap, feeling like a widow before my husband had even left me. That was the day I felt the last thread of hope begin to fray. And that was the exact moment I heard the nurses talking. The breeze was soft that day, brushing against my skin like a memory. Somewhere in the courtyard, a mother laughed while chasing her toddler around a patch of grass. An old man read the paper under a dogwood tree. The world kept turning, unchanged, unaware that mine was coming apart thread by thread. I sat still, staring at the cracks in the sidewalk, trying not to think about how I'd just left my husband lying in a hospital bed with less than 20% of his blood cells functioning. Trying not to think about how his doctor had said, "We're running out of time," and didn't even bother finishing the sentence. Then I heard it. 2 nurses were sitting on the bench behind me, sipping coffee, and talking the way people do when they don't know their words are about to alter someone's entire life. "You know that guy in ICU, Calder? He looks just like that guy from Pine Hollow. I swear, it's like seeing the same face twice." I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My heart slammed into my ribs so hard I thought I might be sick. Pine Hollow, a tiny mountain town 2 hours east of Nashville. I'd only been there once during nursing school for a community clinic, the kind of place where life moved slower, where everyone knew everyone, where family names went back generations. Could it be nothing more than coincidence? Could it be everything? For a moment, I thought about turning around, asking the nurse for details. But something in me said no. Not yet. Not until I was sure. Because what if? What if there was someone out there who looked like Elias because they were like Elias? What if Elias wasn't as alone in this world as he always believed? I remembered the night we sat on our porch after yet another failed IVF cycle. I was crying into his chest, blaming my body, blaming fate, and he just held me, whispering, "You are my family, that's all I need." I thought about how many nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering where he came from, wondering why no one had ever claimed him, wondering if blood really meant anything at all. And now, maybe it did. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, hands trembling. For the first time in weeks, I felt something move inside me. Something I hadn't dared let myself feel. Hope, not the bright, blazing kind, not yet. This was quieter, raw, fragile, like a match in the wind, but still burning. I didn't have a name, I didn't have an address. I didn't have a plan. But I had a town. I had Pine Hollow. and I had a husband who was running out of time. So I walked back into the hospital, wiped my face, signed an emergency leave form, and kissed Elias on the forehead. He looked at me with that half-smile he always wore when he knew I was up to something and whispered, "You look like you're about to take on the world." And I told him the only thing I could say without telling the truth. "Just rest, I'll be back before you know it." Because I couldn't give him promises, but maybe, just maybe, I could bring him a brother. The road to Pine Hollow stretched out like a faded memory, long, quiet, winding, through hills and pastures and broken fences. Every mile away from the hospital felt both wrong and necessary. I kept checking my phone even though no one was calling, even though Elias couldn't. I had no address, no name, just a town and the ghost of a resemblance that might mean everything or nothing. But I drove, past gas stations with rusted signs, past front yards littered with plastic flamingos and porch swings, until the hills opened into a clearing and the town appeared, small, tucked into itself, like a place that had stopped growing years ago. I parked outside a general store that smelled like tobacco and old wood. A man behind the counter looked up, eyes kind but cautious, like he wasn't sure if I was lost or just passing through. I walked up with my phone in hand and showed him the picture of Elias. My voice came out tighter than I meant. "Have you seen anyone who looks like him?" He stared at the screen for a long second, then nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, scratching his chin. "That looks an awful lot like Luke Henderson. Lives out past County Road 6 near the old cornfield. Quiet guy, keeps to himself." Luke, a name. My pulse surged. I thanked him and followed his directions through narrow back roads until the pavement cracked and the map stopped updating. Then I saw it, a weathered mailbox leaning sideways, paint peeling, with the name Henderson barely legible beneath layers of time. Behind it stood a house that might have once been blue but was now mostly gray, surrendered to rain and sun and silence. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. What was I about to do? Knock on a stranger's door and tell him he might be my husband's long-lost brother? What if he slammed the door? What if I was wrong? But then I pictured Elias, his breath shallow, his eyes dimming, and I opened the car door. The porch creaked beneath my feet. The wooden door moaned as I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. And then it opened. He was taller than I expected. Broad-shouldered, tired eyes, a mechanic's shirt stained with grease. But it wasn't his clothes or his build that stopped me cold. It was his eyes. They were Elias's eyes. The same stormy blue, the same shape. For a second, it felt like looking at a version of my husband carved from different years. He blinked at me, guarded. "Can I help you?" I held out my phone, the screen showing the photo of Elias, taken last summer on our porch, smiling in the late light. "This is my husband," I said. "His name is Elias Calder. Someone said you looked like him." He stared at the picture, his brows folding in a slow, unsettled crease. Then he stepped back and ran a hand through his hair, like his body was reacting before his mind caught up. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. He looked back at me, softer now. "Who are you?" "I'm his wife," I said. "My name is Joanna." There was a long pause, then almost too quietly to hear. I think he might be my brother." That word, brother, landed like a tremor in my chest. He invited me in. The house smelled like coffee and sawdust, scattered with boots and old photographs in mismatched frames. He poured 2 mugs without asking, sat down across from me, elbows on his knees, jaw clenched. I told him everything. About Elias, about the disease, about the transplant he needed, about how there was no family, no match, no time left. I tried to stay composed, but my voice cracked halfway through. He didn't say anything for a minute. Just looked down at the photo again, as if memorizing the face he never knew he'd been missing. Then he stood up and said the words I never expected to hear. "I'll do it." No hesitation, no request for proof, no demand for answers. "He's my brother," Luke said. "That's all I need." And just like that, the road home wasn't empty anymore. Luke grabbed his truck keys, a denim jacket from a hook by the door, and told me to lead the way. He didn't ask to think it over. Didn't call anyone. didn't even pause to close the kitchen cabinet he'd left open. He just came. I remember glancing at him in the rearview mirror as we drove back through the hills, his old pickup following behind me like a shadow that had finally found its shape. Rain started falling, a thin, steady drizzle that made the world outside feel soft and slow. But inside, my pulse thundered with something I hadn't felt in weeks. Movement. By the time we reached Vanderbilt, the sky had turned the color of bruised cotton. I walked him through the sterile white corridors that had become my second home. Nurses nodded politely, unaware of what this moment meant. When we stepped into Elias's room, he was propped up by pillows, pale and thinner than I'd ever seen him, but still awake, still Elias. His eyes brightened when he saw me. Then they drifted past me to Luke, and everything stopped. For a second, it felt like neither of them could breathe. Elias's lips parted, but no sound came out. Luke took a step forward, cleared his throat, his voice low and rough from disuse. "I think I'm your brother." Elias blinked, once, twice, as if trying to decide whether this was a dream or a hallucination brought on by medication. Then his mouth trembled, and tears filled his eyes. "My brother," he whispered, the words fragile as glass. I stood back and watched the two of them look at each other, both stunned by the familiarity, the unspoken bond threaded through decades of absence. Elias reached out a trembling hand. Luke took it firmly. "We'll talk later," Luke said. "But right now, I'm here to save your life." The doctors moved fast. When I explained who Luke was and how closely he might be related, they immediately ran genetic testing. Every hour felt like a week. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat in the waiting room, clutching my phone, my heart caught in limbo between prayer and fear. When the hematologist finally walked in, her face softened with the kind of smile I'd learned to fear, because it usually came before bad news. But this time, her eyes lit with something else. "He's a match," she said. "One of the best we've seen in a long time." My legs nearly gave out. I turned to Luke, who stood frozen, lips parted in disbelief. "You're a match," I said, the words barely making it past my throat. "You can save him." He took a long breath. Then he nodded. "Then let's do it." That night, I stepped into the hallway to give them space. Through the glass window, I watched the two of them talk, first awkwardly, like strangers still learning each other's outlines, and then slowly warming, like embers flickering back to life. Elias spoke softly, his voice breaking as he said, "I used to dream about having a brother. Thought maybe it was childish, like wishing for a star to fall just for you. But here you are." Luke smiled, tired but real. "Guess life had other plans." "I'm sorry you didn't know about me," Elias said, reaching for Luke's hand again. "I'm sorry we lost all that time." Luke shook his head. "We've got time now." When I walked back in, Elias looked up at me with wet eyes and a trembling smile. "I have a brother," he whispered. "I'm not alone." I kissed his forehead, pressing my own tears into his skin. "You never were." The morning of the transplant, the sky was clear and sharp, the kind of autumn blue that makes the world feel briefly perfect. I held Elias's hand as they prepped him, his skin warm but his fingers trembling. "You ready?" I whispered. He smiled faintly. "As I'll ever be." Luke stood on the other side of the room, wearing a thin hospital gown that didn't quite match the grit in his eyes. He was calm, calmer than I was. He even joked with the nurse about whether they gave out stickers for bravery. But beneath the smile I could see it. The weight. The realization that he wasn't just donating cells, he was giving a man he barely knew the chance to live. He walked over to Elias, reached for his hand, and said only one thing. "I got you." And Elias, through tears, whispered back, "Thank you for finding me." The procedure itself took hours. I paced outside like my body couldn't stand still unless his heart was. Every time a door opened, I flinched. Every beep, every shuffle of feet, it all felt too loud. When it was done, the doctor emerged, pulling down her mask with a cautious smile. "It went well," she said. "Now we wait." And so we did. The days that followed were a quiet kind of war. Blood counts, immune markers, fever spikes, moments of fear, and moments of hope. But slowly, the tide began to turn. I started to notice things. The color coming back into Elias's cheeks. The way his voice got stronger when he asked for coffee. How he laughed again, quiet at first like he was testing the sound, but then louder, freer. Luke stayed at the hospital. He didn't leave, even when we told him he could. He slept in an old pull-out chair in the waiting room, his boots tucked under the seat, a thermos of coffee always nearby. One night, I found him staring through the glass at Elias's room, arms crossed over his chest. "He's really my brother," he said softly, as if still convincing himself. And I nodded. "Yes, he is." There was no ceremony, no grand reveal, just small, sacred moments, two men learning each other's faces, sharing childhood stories from opposite ends of a broken past, laughing at how they both hated olives, realizing they had the same crooked smile, the same way of tapping their fingers when they were deep in thought. Elias still had a long road ahead, but something had shifted. The fear wasn't gone, but it wasn't the only thing in the room anymore. Now there was warmth, familiarity, the comfort of not walking through the fire alone. We used to think family was something you had to be born into. Now, we knew better. Family is also who walks beside you when the world falls apart. Family is the stranger who shows up when no one else can. Family is a man who opens his door and says, "Let's save him." And sometimes family is found just in time. Elias took his first steps outside the hospital 12 days after the transplant. They weren't strong or steady, but they were his. I walked beside him along the garden path behind the recovery wing, leaves crunching beneath our shoes, the air cool with the bite of early fall. He paused every few steps, catching his breath, gripping the railing like it was the only thing tethering him to the earth. But his eyes, God, his eyes, they were clear again, focused, alive. He squeezed my hand and whispered, "I forgot how good the sun feels." A week later, he was discharged. We packed up the blankets, the half-read books, the bouquet of cards from coworkers and old patients. Luke was waiting outside with his pickup truck, the same one that had followed me from Pine Hollow just weeks ago. Now, it led the way back. Back to our little wooden house on the edge of Nashville. Back to what was left of the life we almost lost. But when we walked in, something felt different. It wasn't just the dust or the silence that had settled while we were gone. It was the presence of something new, someone new. Luke carried the last bag through the door, looked around at the creaky floors, the sun-stained porch, the mismatched kitchen chairs, and smiled. "This place feels like it's been waiting for me," he said. And it had. In the weeks that followed, he became a part of us. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the screen door, helped Elias sand a new tabletop in the garage, sat with me on the porch in the mornings while the kettle boiled, both of us sipping coffee like we'd done it forever. They shared stories, what little Elias could recall from foster homes, what Luke remembered from their chaotic mother, from nights when silence filled the hallways and no one came when he cried. One evening, Luke reached into a small wooden box and pulled out a worn pocket knife with initials scratched into the handle. "This belonged to our dad," he said, holding it out to Elias. "It's all I have left of him, and I want you to have it." Elias took it with both hands, his fingers trembling, his eyes glistening. He didn't say thank you. He just held it like something sacred. People from Pine Hollow began sending letters, casseroles, even hand-knitted scarves for the chilly days ahead. They wrote things like, "Family is everything, and sometimes the people you've never met are the ones who save you." It was humbling in a way I can't explain, like being caught in a net of kindness so wide you didn't even know it had a name. Elias got stronger. His laugh returned, full-throated and rich. He started building again, slowly at first, a few small shelves, a birdhouse. Then one afternoon, he called me out to the porch. There it was, a brand-new rocking chair. Carved by hand, curved just like the first one he ever made for me. "For you," he said simply. "For every night I thought I'd never come back to this porch." I sat down, the wood warm beneath me, and rocked gently while tears blurred the world around me. Because somehow, despite everything we'd lost, we had found something more. Not just a cure, not just a second chance, but a place to start over. Together. The leaves had turned golden by the time we drove back to Pine Hollow. Elias wanted to see it, really see it, not just from a hospital bed or through the haze of exhaustion. He wanted to walk the streets where his brother had grown up, breathe the mountain air, stand on the same porch Luke had stood on for 35 years, waiting for a piece of himself he never knew was missing. That evening, we built a fire behind Luke's house. Just a simple circle of stones, dry wood, a couple of lawn chairs that had seen better days. The night air was crisp, the kind that makes you pull your sweater a little tighter and feel alive in a way you forgot you could. Luke sat across from us, his best friend's daughter curled up in his lap, fast asleep, after roasting marshmallows and chasing fireflies. I watched him cradle her like he'd done it forever, and something warm unfurled in my chest. Elias reached over and took my hand. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think being an orphan meant I'd always be alone." I turned to him, eyes stinging in the firelight. "You were never alone," I said. "You just hadn't been found yet." He smiled, the kind that sits somewhere between gratitude and awe. "I have you. I have him. I have us." We sat in silence for a long time, the fire crackling, the logs glowing soft red at the edges. I rested my head on Elias's shoulder, and Luke poked at the embers with a stick, lost in his own thoughts. And I realized we weren't broken anymore. Wounded, yes, but also mended in ways we never expected. Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine, it comes from being seen, from being claimed, from someone showing up at your door with nothing but a photo and a desperate hope, and being met not with suspicion, but with a seat at the table. Family isn't always blood, but sometimes by some miracle, it is. And when it is, it's beautiful. That night, under a sky full of stars, I knew we were going to be okay. Not because everything was perfect, but because we were together. And that was enough. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever loved someone so deeply you were willing to walk through fire for them, or if you've ever believed that hope can bloom even in the darkest places, then subscribe to Avenged Stories. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we remember the ones who never gave up, and we honor the ones who fought for love when the world said it was too late.